as church. Now, we are in a new series starting this year on the book of Ecclesiastes. And every message is going to be entitled in some form or another, Under the Sun. And that's the theme for the series itself, is the phrase under the sun. And we'll get into that in just a second. Ecclesiastes might seem like a little bit of a downer. Why are we doing Ecclesiastes? It's kind of like life's hard. It's terrible. Nothing's going to work. That's just the way it is. Get over it. It's easy to look at Ecclesiastes that way, but it is also a very, very deep and very important message to us. I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me about Ecclesiastes is people will say that there's a dispute over who the author of Ecclesiastes is. Is it Solomon or is it somebody else? I think that it is purely and simply Solomon. I don't think there's any reason for that. And, pardon me for just a second. This must be better. Yeah. Sorry. If I didn't have problems with the mic, I wouldn't know what to do. So, we talked about the theme of this series, which is under the sun. And that's a phrase that is used 58 times in this book. And when the author uses that phrase, he's referring to a life lived solely in what I've referred to as the horizontal. Because we talk about horizontal and vertical. We talk about a life of being connected with God on a vertical basis and being connected with other people on a horizontal basis. So, I don't know if you can hear me now. There we go. All right. So, a vertical connection or a horizontal connection. When we're talking with the author, which again I believe is Solomon, is talking about under the sun, he is talking about a life lived solely on that horizontal basis. This is a life that is not focused on God or really involved with God in any way. It's a life apart from God with no vertical connection to God. And it's interesting to me, I was getting ready to say that there's this dispute over who is the author. Solomon to me fits. First off, he's king of Jerusalem, everything that, is a son of David, everything that's being talked about all makes sense with it being Solomon. Including the life of the author of this book fits with the life of Solomon. It doesn't really fit with anybody else. And it's super interesting to me because people will say, well, there's a lot of thinking that says it's somebody other than Solomon, but I've yet to hear a message that's preached where they say it's not Solomon. So it's kind of that weird thing of people point to it and say, well, there's a lot of people that think it's somebody other than Solomon, but then they think it's Solomon. I think it's Solomon. I think it makes sense that it's Solomon. It fits with Solomon, and so I'm going with Solomon. And that's just kind of how I see it. But the author in Solomon is basically, because Solomon is uniquely positioned to be talking about what the subject of this book is, which is you can go out and try to find all kinds of other things to fulfill you, make you happy, bring you peace, bring you whatever. You can try all this other stuff out there, and guess what? None of it works. And Solomon is a guy who can say, look, if anybody knows that, it's going to be me. Because I've had the means and the ability and the method to go out and search for the world. In essence, Ecclesiastes is Solomon's curriculum vitae, his resume, for why he's the dude that can tell you that none of this stuff is going to work. And he's had a life where he's walked away from God. He's drifted away. And it's important to see that because this is firsthand in the moment declaration of what it's like when we're not really following God. Because if you look at the way that this is written, you begin with the end. The conclusion is where Solomon starts. And it's where he starts as he moves along through. There is a tremendous amount of repetition in the book of Ecclesiastes. And I think it's done for effect, and I think it's done on purpose so that we see these points occurring over and over and over again. And there's three main points in the second chapter that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be dealing with the first kind of set of things, which is the vanity of self-indulgence. Then there will be the vanity of living wisely, and then we will be talking about the vanity of toil. And we're going to break those up into 3 weeks because it's important to look at those individually. So today we're looking at the vanity of self-indulgence. We saw in chapter 1, verse 2, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Vanity is a term that also appears repeatedly through this book. And it basically is saying, look, it's not that it's pointless, these things are pointless, but they're smoke. They're transitory. They don't really matter. You can see smoke, you can see mist, you can see fog, but you can't embrace it, you can't hold on to it. It escapes your grasp. And that's what all of this stuff that vanities is all about. It's not really real. It may seem real, but it's not something that you can put your faith in and really grab a hold of, because it'll just disappear like fog, like mist. And then when we begin chapter 2, starting in verse 1, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. So this is where I'm going to start with you, but want you to know right up front, it's vanity. The author is boldly telling us that all of this stuff is pointless, and then he tells us how it is that he comes to that conclusion. We talked about last week the two potential lenses that you can look at the book of Ecclesiastes through. The first one is, basically, here is Solomon whining about his life and whining about God. And it's all about how hard it is and how difficult things are and how God has not been faithful to him. And if you look at if you believe that that's the lens that Solomon is really speaking through and really focusing on, then we have to question whether we will see Solomon in heaven. Is Solomon truly a follower of God, or is he drifted off so much that there's no coming back? The second lens is Solomon isn't whining, he's warning. He's saying, this was my life. This is how I lived my life. Please don't do it. Please don't live like I lived. Live completely differently. Do 180 degrees from where I am, and that's how you should live your life. And as I told you last week, I think that's the lens we need to look at Ecclesiastes through. He is not whining. He is warning us. Solomon is trying to figure out the meaning of life and whether there can be any meaning apart from God. And what Solomon is really doing is giving his personal testimony about his journey and trying everything in an effort to find some kind of meaning in life. But he comes to the conclusion that there is nothing under the sun, there is nothing in a life apart from God that is going to work. The end of chapter 1 is the setup for Solomon's testimony. And now chapter 2 begins to flesh out the details of his search for the meaning of life. And we talked about vanity as the second primary theme at play in this book. So let's look at the first 11 verses of chapter 2, and then we'll dive in a little bit deeper. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest and growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. Again, real easy to look at that and go, boy, sucks to be me, kind of thing. I mean, that's kind of one of those, one of those places where somebody's sitting there saying, what are you doing? I mean, are you just talking about how bad things are? Are you just whining? And the reality is, what Solomon is saying is, look, I had it all in the eyes of the world, and none of it really mattered. Vanity, as it's being used in this context, means emptiness and meaninglessness. Vanity describes how life feels when our focus is under the sun, where God is left out of the equation. Again, a life that is strictly horizontal and not vertical in terms of a connection with God. Solomon, and I think this is important for us to see, Solomon has experienced, possessed, had access to all that the world held dear. And he has come to see it as meaningless. It is vapor without God as part of the equation. Solomon is writing from a place of emptiness, and he is thrashing a bit in that process. And what do I mean by thrashing? Thrashing is what I think everybody in, it's hard to look at Solomon and say everybody in Solomon's place, because none of us are really in Solomon's place. None of us have the understanding of the kind of wealth, power, possessions that Solomon is going through. But anybody going through a test, a trial, is going to have a tendency to, as I describe it, thrash a little bit, protest, say, look, what's going on here? What's going on? I don't really want to accept this for what it is. I want things my way. I want to move through this and get going. And one of the questions that I've been asking myself is, what is God's purpose for this book in our lives? The book of Ecclesiastes. What is God's purpose for this book? It's a question I started asking myself way back when I thought this is the direction that we ought to head. Because I don't think that the purpose of this book is for us to use it to look back on the life of an old man who is consumed with regret. It's easy to go there. It's easy to see this as Solomon saying, I am filled with nothing but regret over my life. And to look at that is almost kind of a biographical account of this old guy who's filled with regret. But I think God intends for us to take this book and use this book to examine our own lives as we move forward. To realize that no matter where we are in our lives, there is a new day coming. And how are we going to use it? Look, I'm 67 years old. It's real easy for me to look at life and go, well, that's it. Check, please, let's go. Until you realize that there's plenty more to do. There's a world that needs to know Jesus. There's a ton of stuff to do. And it isn't about comfort and ease and all of that sort of stuff. There may be really, really difficult stuff to deal with. No question about it. But how are we going to deal with that? Are we going to focus on God, or are we going to focus on ourselves? We are taking a look at our lives and the trajectory of our lives, and what are we going to pursue? Because what it is that we pursue is what really matters, and the question we have to ask ourselves is, what really matters to us? This is really a discussion about what we focus on in terms of finding meaning, and the realignment in us that is by necessity taking place, must take place in us. And when I mean realignment, I mean a conscious realignment. And what is it that we will realign? Will we realign and prioritize the things that are external? Or will we realign and prioritize the things that are internal? Because if we're going to prioritize the things that are external, the stuff, the things, the projects, the relationships, the place that we live, the car that we drive, the shoes that we wear, any of those kinds of things, and that's what defines us, then what are we really realigning? Or are we realigning and looking at a prioritization of the things that really truly matter, the things that are internal? Verses 1 through 3. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad. And of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. What Solomon is really saying here, what he's really talking about, is something kind of odd. Because if you think about it, what he's talking about is he's going to run an experiment. And he's in a position to run an experiment. He's testing, trying out all of the areas of life under the sun that people gravitate to in order to find happiness in the world. It's important to see that Solomon isn't talking about losing his mind or a life given over to total debauchery. That's not what he's talking about. The question is whether there are areas that we normally gravitate to and feel an affinity towards that will provide fulfillment in some way for us. In our text today, Solomon is putting to the test 3 areas. 3 common areas people go to in an effort to try and find fulfillment or happiness in life. Our pleasure, hedonism, depending on how you pronounce it. Our work, productivity, and our stuff or possessions. I have a real urge to go with the 3 Ps. You love to do that kind of stuff and just come up with, things that roll off your tongue. Pleasure, productivity, and possessions, the 3 Ps. That's kind of what he's talking about. The first conclusion that Solomon will come to is simply this, that a life devoted to the pursuit of sensual pleasures is a life that will never bring genuine fulfillment. Verse 1, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. Notice the terminology that Solomon is using. I will test you with pleasure. Solomon has begun his grand experiment. And the first area examined is that of sensual pleasures, what we would refer to as hedonism. I would suggest that most people make decisions based on what will maximize pleasure and happiness. I know you don't want to think that. I know we don't want to believe that that's the case. I know that we don't want to think about that being the way that people look at life, but I think it is. I think that most people make decisions based on what will maximize their pleasure and their happiness as they see it. And I'm going to go a bit further and say something to you that you might find odd. I think people instinctively turn to pleasure every chance they get. And not in an effort to find ultimate meaning, but rather as a distraction from a life that is defined by a lack of meaning. It's an escape. People go to pleasure not instinctively to find meaning in pleasure, because I think intuitively people realize that's not really truly meaning. We want to try to define it that way. We want to try to shoehorn it into that and say that's why I'm going after it, because that way I'll find meaning in this physical hedonistic pleasure. But the reality is people when you pull the sheets off, people realize that's not what it's about. So it's more than finding meaning, it's a distraction from a life that's meaningless. And it's an escape. How does Solomon approach this focus personally? How does he focus that and deal with that focus on pleasure personally? Does he approach it with restraint? Does he approach it in his own life from a place of, well, you got to be careful with this? Well, we kind of see his answer in verse 10. And whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, For my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Solomon works hard, and boy, he plays hard. Not a great deal of restraint or moderation in Solomon. I mean, let's be real. We talked about this a little bit last week. Despite whether you find there's wisdom in this or not, and again, this is the man that's supposedly the wisest person on the planet. He has 700 wives and 300 concubines. I don't think that is a display of incredible wisdom for any number of reasons. But what it is, look, I can't communicate effectively with one. So I can't imagine 700. But the reality is this as well. This also tells us how Solomon views physical pleasure. This is a man who is being intimate at some level with 1,000 different women. 1,000. This is a man that if you ask the question, is sex a big deal to Solomon? Yeah, I kind of think the answer is obvious. I think to say that he looks to sex for gratification and fulfillment is putting it very, very mildly. And the thing is, and he knows this at this point, it all left him nothing but empty. And the worst part of it was that his focus on these women took him away from a pursuit of the one true God and led him to a pursuit of their false gods and their idols. Because one of the ways that Solomon expanded his range and his power and his influence were these relationships and these marriages that took place with the daughters of kings from around the region. I mean, that's how he extended his tent pegs. Is he married into these other royal families and then gained a tremendous amount of control and influence as a result. And so if you look at these situations, people love to. It's like with Adam and Eve. People love to blame Eve and give Adam a pass. People love to look at Solomon and give him a bit of a pass for, well, it was the women that brought in all these false gods in. Come on. Solomon knew exactly what he was doing. This was about power and influence to him. You can't take a young woman or an older woman or whatever age they were who's been raised in a culture with this set of beliefs and this set of gods, and then there's an arranged marriage between her and Solomon, and she's going to continue to worship her gods, and he's going to let her, and oh, by the way, he's going to start worshiping her gods as well, along with the other 699 women that he's married to, and the 300 concubines. And remember this about a concubine. A concubine is nothing in that culture and at that time but a sexual object. They have no value other than that. It is the ultimate degradation of a person for pleasure. And this is Solomon that's doing this. And he knows what he's doing. He don't get no free pass on this deal. Solomon tries laughter. Party hardy. And all that laughter entails. And for him, all that it symbolized. But it doesn't work. In fact, as Solomon sees it, laughter is just madness. Laughter cannot give us a basis for our lives. It's nice to laugh. It's nice to be around funny people and have a good time and laugh about things. But it's important to remember this. Laughter might distract us from our pain for a moment. But it cannot overcome that pain. And when this stuff does not seem to work, Solomon heads into a different area. He tries alcohol. Verse 3, I search with my heart how to cheer my body with wine. And again, he's not talking about going out and getting hopelessly drunk. He's talking about turning to wine as a means of trying to make his life better. Look, a whole bunch of people have turned to the bottle, a dope sack, or both, in an effort to find hope and happiness. And dope sack is a street term for a supply of narcotics or drugs of some kind. It's your little supply that you run around with that is going to keep you going and keep you thinking that you can anesthetize yourself and that's going to work. So people will turn to the bottle and they'll turn to their dope sack in an effort to try to find happiness. The belief that if we get drunk enough or high enough and laugh with everybody else who's drunk or high, then we can drown out our pain and that will be happiness. But when we wake up after a night of this mess, we are still empty. Only now we're hungover, or beat up, or have no money, or have a car that's wrecked, or have a DWI, or whatever it might be. We have the same life and the same problems we've always had, only now they're probably worse. Now Solomon will move on to the second phase or place in an effort to find fulfillment and happiness, work and productivity. We see it in verses 4 through 6. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of the growing trees. I made great works. This is really the opposite of the hedonistic party lifestyle that Solomon has just been discussing. The hedonistic lifestyle really is a total waste. It accomplishes nothing other than the pursuit of pleasure, meaningless pleasure. Nothing comes from it. A focus on work or productivity or creating things is different. Productivity is bound to provide Solomon with some kind of answer. After all, you are creating things, you're building things, things are new, things are there. But Solomon will come to the realization that a workaholic lifestyle focused on productivity is not what's going to provide fulfillment or happiness. I mean, if you go to the self-help section of any bookstore, go to Barnes & Noble in Lakewood and go to the self-help section, and you will see title after title after title of books that seem to tell you that if you just do the following things that this author wants you to do, then your life will be fulfilled and happy, and you'll unleash the giant within. You'll step out and be the champion. You'll be a big deal. You'll be all that in a bag of chips. None of it means anything. But Solomon would be at the top of anybody's richest people list. You may remember a television show that I could not stand. It was called Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. Remember that? I'm Robert Leach. We're at the home of Solomon, king of all things. I mean, you could just see Robert Leach talking about Solomon and all of the things that Solomon has. And the 700 Mrs. Solomons are here to visit with them, I mean, it's hubris. It's all about ego. It's all about wanting what other people have. That's why that show was popular. Because people want what other people have. They think that that kind of lifestyle is what matters. What makes somebody have value or importance. Solomon is at the top of anybody's list. He's probably the wealthiest person who has ever lived. And he did try to buy happiness. And if it could be done, he would have been the one to do it. And he tries being creative and productive. He builds houses, really builds palaces. He builds cities, he builds gardens, he builds pools, he builds parks. You name it, he built it. All in an effort to stay busy, accomplish big things, and be a big deal. With happiness and fulfillment as the desired end. A bigger house in a better neighborhood is bound to lead to a better life. Sound familiar? Did it work for Solomon? Well, we see the answer to that question in verse 11. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity, and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. You have to ask the question, because there's an interesting inconsistency here, or a seeming inconsistency, is that, are we talking about an inconsistency with the back half of verse 10? What is meant in verse 10 by, I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. So on one hand, he's saying, my heart found pleasure in all my toil. And on the other hand, he's saying it was all my toil, it was vanity. What Solomon means is that there is some satisfaction that comes via accomplishment, but there is a problem. And the problem is that the satisfaction in feeling accomplishment is at best temporary. It's always on to the next thing. Look, think about it. Think about whatever you might have accomplished in your life. I mean, going through and taking seminary classes. I mean, one of the things that my natural proclivity being kind of performance-based since I was a kid is what's the next one? Okay, you've gotten here. Where do you go from here? What's the next step? What's the next degree? What's the next class? You better get all A's. If you don't get all A's, then what happened? What's the problem? I mean, in the business world, we were in the RV business. We went to rallies. We're #1 dealer for Monaco and Safari. First year out. Did I rejoice? Well, for a moment. Then guess what? How are we going to repeat it again and again and again and again? How's it going to get better? How's it going to get bigger? When I'm practicing law, what's the next case? And is it going to be bigger? And is it going to be better? And is it going to be getting more attention? What is it going to be about? The next turnaround in the business world, is it going to be more successful? You can't, if you're focused on that kind of world and that kind of thing where your working is going to be what gives you value and reward, it's never enough. Solomon will talk about that repeatedly through this book. We'll talk about the fact that if you're focusing on what your eyes can see, your ears can hear, and all of that kind of stuff, there's never going to be enough. You're never going to be happy with the things of this world. It is only a life focused on God that will bring true contentment and satisfaction. Any joy that we find in this world, in a life under the sun, is at best transitory and temporary. So Solomon turns to the third place step area to talk about possessions. Verses 7 through 9. I bought male and female slaves, and had slaves who were born in my house. I had also great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delight of the sons of man. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. This is an incredibly important lesson, because one of the things to think about here is, where does Solomon kind of come out of the gate talking about his possessions? He's talking about people. He's talking about slaves that he had, slaves that he bought, and slaves that were born to other slaves that were in his possession. He talks about concubines. He talks about people that are his possessions. He's viewing these concubines as literally nothing but another form of slave. They're sex slaves. They're people that are possessions for him. Slaves are possessions for him. That's the problem with valuing this stuff from a possession and a wealth standpoint. You devalue human life to the point where it's just a possession. It's not about them. It's about him. It's about what he has, what he owns. It's important that we look at the reality that possessions and money will not solve our issues and problems. A materialistic lifestyle focused on what we possess can never make us truly happy. We think money will make us happy. We think our stuff will make us happy. I don't know how many of you remember a comedian by the name of George Carlin. You probably didn't follow George Carlin, and that's a good thing, because George was not necessarily the cleanest of comics. But one of the things that George talked about was our stuff and our focus on our stuff. And he would say, our stuff is the most important thing for us. He goes, that's the reason we have a house. You have to have a house because you need a place for your stuff. Why do you get a bigger house? Well, you got more stuff. And if you got more stuff, you have to have a bigger place to keep your stuff. And so on and so on and so on. The more stuff we get, the bigger a place we need to keep it. And that's the way the world looks at things. We have so much stuff that there's an industry out there where people make tons of money by owning storage units. I'm real pleased at kind of how we've minimized and downsized our life, coming from a house in Gig Harbor to an apartment in Tacoma. But let me tell you something. We still got a 10 by 10 foot storage unit at the end of Center Street, the Daffodil Storage Facility. Make it sound all nice and pleasant. The Daffodil Storage Facility. And you got your stuff in the Daffodil Storage Facility. And I mean, they're all over the place. I have stuff. It was funny. When we moved from the house in Gig Harbor to Tacoma, we realized that I had boxes of stuff that were taped up, that were from college. Mind you, I graduated from college in 1978. And those boxes had remained boxed up with duct tape on them and had gone from place to place to place for over 30 years. Not opened. Just moved from one place to the next. Did that stuff matter? I would think not. Because none of it even being looked at, much less used, much less considered in all of that period of time. Solomon had plenty of stuff, more than anyone could imagine or dream of, but none of it could make him genuinely happy. In our society, people have more stuff now than ever before in the history of mankind. And you know what? 1 in 10 of us are on antidepressants. 1 in 10. Are we better off and happier because we have all this stuff? The anecdotal evidence would tend to indicate just the opposite. Solomon says in verse 9, so I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. And basically, look, I'm the greatest of all time. But he also notes that also my wisdom remains with me. I didn't go berserk in his pursuit of pleasure. Solomon is conducting an experiment and analyzing the results of his experiments, and he's doing it all in real time. We'll see that as we go through this book. This is all happening in real time. It's in the moment, it's in the present, and he's looking at all of this. It is not wrong to have fun. We should have fun and enjoy ourselves. I am not a believer in the monastic life that says you go and live in a cave and don't talk to anybody and just read your Bible and don't have interaction with anybody and don't eat food that tastes good and drink sour water and do all of those kinds of things and wear clothing that is uncomfortable to constantly remind you of your sinful existence. I'm not talking about that. I think God wants us to have pleasure in our lives, to enjoy our lives. The question is this. It's not wrong to have pleasure and it's not wrong to have stuff. But it becomes a problem when the pleasure and the stuff have us. And that's what it's about. Solomon learned that no matter how much he had of anything, it was never enough. And Solomon identifies areas where we look to for fulfillment and then declares that all of those areas are nothing but vanity. All the roads lead us to a dead man. But there is a God-sized hole, God-shaped hole in all of us. And the reality of a God-sized or shaped hole is that there's only one thing that can fill that hole, and that's God. And we try to fill it with a bunch of stuff. Solomon's talking about all the things that he and others try to fill it with. Sex and money and possessions and wine and drugs and whatever it might be. We spend a tremendous amount of time trying to fill that hole. A hole that can only be filled by God. Jesus tells us in John chapter 14, verse 6, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. How are you trying to find fulfillment? How are you trying to fill the hole that's inside of you? Make this the day that you stop running, stop chasing after things that are only vanity, that can't be grasped, and turn once and for all to Jesus. The question was and still is, where will we focus in our effort to find meaning? There's nothing wrong with enjoying life. Laughter, experiencing pleasure, any of those things, but none of those things give us our meaning or existence. It is not an issue of having fun and having things. The issue is, do those things have us? That's the question. We live in a culture that worships at the altar of it feels good, do it. But doing whatever feels good is dangerous, and it will never satisfy your soul. Will we use our effort in an attempt to reorganize the external things, or will we see that it is really all about the internal things? It's not about stuff. It's about a life that is focused on Jesus. Solomon is giving us a warning. And it's a warning that we have to pay attention to, because it's about a life and how we're going to lead it and where we're going to focus and where the emphasis is going to be in our life. Is it going to be on things that are nothing but transitory and don't really mean anything at all? Or is it going to be about the eternal? The eternal, internal focus on Jesus. A connection with God. Lord, I thank you for today. I thank you for your many blessings. Lord, show us where you want us to focus, where you want us to be, where you want us to put our emphasis, and help us to get there. Help us to see this message from Solomon for what it is. That it is a life that is, it's about a warning. It's about a life that needs to be lived for Jesus. Help us to live it in that way. And I pray these things in your name, Lord.